各位朋友，晚上好！欢迎您来到由中国人民大学哲学与认知科学跨学科交叉平台与服务器艺术联合主办的哲学与认知科学明德讲坛暨服务器艺术认知心灵哲学系列论坛。我们特邀在哲学、科学、人文、艺术等领域的专家学者组成策划委员会，每期策划一个主题，邀请嘉宾在线直播。那么接下来，让我们有请今天的主持人。中国人民大学哲学院硕士研究生雷木春，有请。
大家晚上好，我是今天的主持人雷木春，欢迎大家来到中国人民大学哲学与认知科学明德讲坛第45期，同时也是服务器艺术认知心灵哲学系列线上讲座第16期。我们这一次的主题是时间视角中的变化 （Change in Temporal Perspective）。那围绕这个主题，我们会讨论以下问题。以时间视角看待变化会涉及什么？具有一个变化者的时间视角会涉及什么？我们应当如何理解对上述两个问题的回答之间的关系，以及对前面三个问题的回答会如何影响对关于变化的形而上学、关于物体的持存的形而上学，以及关于时间的形而上学的争论的理解。那我们这一次邀请到的分享嘉宾是来自伦敦国王学院的哲学教授兼心灵哲学讲席教授 Professor Matthew Soteriou， 以及3位语坛嘉宾，分别是中国人民大学哲学院副教授、中国人民大学哲学与认知科学交叉平台研究员刘畅老师，还有雷丁大学博士、内蒙古大学哲学学院研究员汤志恒老师，以及伦敦大学学院哲学博士、早稻田大学高等研究所副教授郑慧玲老师。有请4位老师。那大家可以互相打个招呼，同时也和观众打个招呼。
嗨，大家
Hello，嗨，大家好。
So let me invite Professor Matthew Soteriou to share your screen and begin your talk. It will last for 1 hour.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk, and to all the commentators. I'm extremely grateful to you for taking the time to do this. I'll share the screen now. Okay, so I'm going to begin my talk with some talk about the end of the talk. So here's something we might say about the end of the talk. At some point, this talk will come to an end, and it will take some time for us to reach the end of the talk. But it's getting closer and closer and closer. So what I'm going to do while we get to the end of the talk is the following. I'm going to be considering some arguments for thinking that some of what I just said can't be true. And I think the most conclusive response to those arguments will be given by your experience of the time that it takes to reach the end of the talk. But while you're having that experience, I'll try to point to some of the traps that can prevent philosophers from acknowledging that. And in particular, I will be focusing on the claim that the end of the talk is getting closer and closer and closer. So my aim in doing this is the following. So I want to consider the following questions. What's involved in occupying a changing temporal perspective? What's involved in occupying a temporal perspective on change? And how should we understand the relation between the answers we give to those questions? So what's the relation between occupying a changing temporal perspective and occupying a temporal perspective on change? And finally, I want to consider how our answers to those questions might bear on our understanding of debates about the metaphysics of change, the metaphysics of persistence of objects, and the metaphysics of time. So I'm going to start by introducing one of the traps, one of the philosophical traps. So here's an argument that the end of the talk is not getting any closer. Here's the first claim. If the end of the talk really is getting closer, then that change in temporal distance implies that something's moving through time. So either you are moving through time, or the end of the talk is moving through time, or both. It's the next premise. But an event can't change its temporal location. So if the end of the talk is getting closer, then you must be the one moving through time. So here the thought is the end of the talk as an event can't be getting any closer than its actual temporal location in the future. So it's not going to move to earlier times, say 20 minutes from now. So you must be the one moving towards the end of the talk if the end of the talk is getting closer in time. Third claim, but movement requires multiple locations. That's to say it requires distinct locations to move from and to. So you can only be moving through time if there are multiple temporal locations, including temporal locations you're moving from. Next claim, any temporal locations you are moving from lie in your past. So if you're moving through time, then past temporal locations exist. So there's indicating there the time of the beginning of the talk, which is earlier than now, and you've moved from the beginning of the talk, the moment you heard me first introduce the talk, and moving through time. So there are parts of your life that occupy those temporal locations in your past, and that will never change because the past doesn't change. So part of your life includes the moment at which you heard me start the talk. And that's something about the past that will never change because the past doesn't change. And any spatio-temporal location that's occupied by any part of your life is a spatio-temporal location that's occupied by you. So if there's an event of you listening to the beginning of the talk in the past, then that event involves you. So you occupy that past temporal location. So if you're moving through time, then you occupy temporal locations that lie in your past, and that will never change. But if you occupy temporal locations that lie in your past, and that never changes, then you never vacate any temporal location that you occupy. So here the thought is that you don't leave that temporal location empty because you're always there. And if you can never vacate any temporal location that you occupy, then you can't move through time. So the conclusion is you're not moving through time, in which case the end of the talk is not getting any closer. Should I pause at that point?
Yeah, I can try to translate this part. 那我们开始设想当前所处的情境，我们可能会说，这个演讲会在一个特定的时间到达终点，然后我们会花一些时间抵达那个位置，或者说这个终点离我们越来越近。但是当我们这样去思考的时候，很有可能会陷入一些陷阱。所以在下面下面的这个论证是想说，我们讲这个讲座的终点离我们越来越近的看法是有问题的。首先，如果我们认为这个讲座的终点它真的离我们越来越近，那我们就要求有东西在时间之中移动。那这个移动的东西可能是我们，或者说是这个讲座的终点。但是讲座的终点 the end of the talk 作为一个事件 event， 它是不能够改变它所处的时间位置的，所以我们只剩下另一个选项，就是我们会在时间之中移动。那移动又要求有多个时间位置，可是有时间位置比如说我们 开始听讲座的那个时间，它是处在我们的过去。然后，如果过去我占据了这个时间，并且过去存在，我就没有办法从这个过去的时间位置空出来，然后移动到其他的位置。所以，这样的一个论证又表明，我们也没有办法支持是我在时间之中移动的观点。所以结论就是，我们最初的想法认为讲座的终点离我们越来越近，看起来是很难成立的。
Okay, so next I want to focus in more detail on that ninth premise. So this one. If you can never vacate any temporal location that you occupy, then you cannot move through time. So I want to say a little bit more about what might be behind that thought. So let's start with the idea of occupying different spatial locations. So an object can occupy different spatial locations by filling a region of space that includes those different spatial locations. And when it does so, it fills a region of space by having different spatial parts at different spatial locations. Okay, so think of a table occupying a region of space. One leg occupies one region of space, another leg occupies another region of space, and so on. And it fills a region of space by its different spatial parts having different spatial locations. So that's one way in which an object can occupy different spatial locations. But an object can also occupy different spatial locations by moving in its entirety from one spatial location to another. So I might move the table from one side of the room to the other side of the room, and now it occupies a different spatial location. So those are two different ways in which an object can occupy different spatial locations, by filling a region of space and by moving in its entirety from one spatial location to another. So the notion that an object can occupy different spatial locations by moving in its entirety from one spatial location to another assumes that the object which has moved has vacated the spatial locations it previously occupied. So it assumes that it's left those previous spatial regions empty by moving in its entirety from that spatial location to another one. So the thought goes, we should likewise hold that an object can occupy different times, different temporal locations, by moving in its entirety from one temporal location to another, only if the object which has moved in time has vacated the temporal location it previously occupied. So going back to the earlier argument that said you occupy temporal locations that lie in your past, and that never changes. If you occupy temporal locations that lie in your past and that never changes, then you never vacate any temporal location that you occupy. And if you can never vacate any temporal location that you occupy, then you can't move through time. So you're not moving through time. So we can generalize that argument now to the conclusion that nothing moves through time. So we can say if any object occupies an interval of time, it does so by having different temporal parts at different temporal locations. And that's a conception of persistence over time that's advocated by the pejorative. So the idea that objects persist over time, they occupy an interval of time by having different temporal parts at different temporal locations within that interval. And now we might then draw some further conclusions about spatial immobility with that pejorative conception of persistence in mind. So we might say, although different temporal parts of a perduring space-occupying object occupy different spatial location, no temporal part of a perduring space-occupying object can change its position in space. So every temporal part of a perduring object is where it is and stays where it is and never changes its spatial location. So if no temporal part of a perduring space occupying object can change its position in space, then the whole perduring object can't change its position in space. So we get the conclusion that nothing changes its position in space. Nothing vacates the spatial location that it occupies. Neither the whole perduring object, which we might think of as a four-dimensional entity, nor any of its temporal parts. And there's some further conclusions we might draw from this. So if you can't move in space, then you can't occupy different spatial perspectives on the very same thing by changing your position in space. So you might have thought that if you, say, move closer to the screen, you're changing your spatial perspective on the screen by changing your position in space. But here the thought is that different temporal parts of you may perceive different temporal parts of an object, the screen, but you can't occupy the kind of changing conscious perceptual perspective that would allow you to get a closer look at a proper part of an object that you currently see. So at best, a distinct proper part of you can perceive a distinct proper part of the object, but never the very same proper part of the object from a different perceptual perspective. Okay, so maybe I should pause there.
Sure. 那在刚才第一部分的论证里面，可能前面几个陈述都会比较容易接受，那么第9个可能还需要一些更多的说明，也就是如果你不能够从之前你占据的时间位置上空出来，那你就不能在时间之中移动，就是要论证这个观点。那在这里会接触到整存论和分存论的观点，以及会就是从理解一个事物如何在空间中占据位置来理解它在时间中的问题。那我们就设想下面2种一个事物占据空间位置的情形。第一种是这个东西，比如说一个桌子，它的不同部分会占据不同的空间位置，这是一种占据空间位置的方式。那第2种是一个物体作为一个整体，还是一个桌子，我们可以移动它，从一个位置移动到另一个位置，这也是占据不同的空间位置的方式。那么如果说一个东西它是以整体的作为一个整体占据了空间，那我们还是回到前面的论证，因为我们论证了你在一开始听讲座的时候占据了一个时间位置，这个时间位置在之前，而之前的事物不能够改变，这也就意味着你没有办法做一个整体从过去的那个位置空出来移动到现在的这个位置。所以基于这样的一种作为整体的理解，我们得出第9个陈述是正确的。那更进一步，我们会有一个扩展的论证，是没有任何东西能够在时间之中移动。所以当我们说一个东西一个事物会占据一段时间的时候，我们并不是说它作为一个整体从过去移动到了现在，而是采纳一种分存论的形式，说它的不同的时间部分占据了不同的时间位置。所以按照这样的一个观点，我们会有下面的一些推论然后这个推论是，是不是应该有2个？对，第一个推论是作为以分存论的形式占据空间的事物，它不会改变它的位置，它只是以它的不同的时间部分占据着不同的时间位置，所以这里不存在位置改变的问题。那第2个推论是，我们之前的一个直觉是，我们好像有一个空间视角或者时间视角离一个东西越来越近。那么这里的推论是说，我们并不是，也不是做一个整体在移动这个空间的视角，而是 我们的不同的部分以那个对象的不同的部分为对象，所以在这里也没有存在时间或者空间的视角发生改变和移动的问题。
So I now want to consider a response to that line of argument. And it begins with a phenomenological observation. So I might say, I seem to have experiences of getting closer to an object I'm moving through space towards. So as I move closer towards the screen, I seem to have an experience of moving closer to the screen. I seem to have an experience of moving through space. And in having those experiences, I seem to occupy a changing conscious spatial point of view on objects I seem to perceive. And that involves apparent change in the spatial location of the origin of my conscious spatial point of view. So think about the visual experience that you're having now, the origin of that visual point of view somewhere around your eyes. And as you move your head closer towards the screen, the origin of your visual point of view seems to be changing its spatial location. The sense that the origin of your conscious spatial point of view is moving through space over time brings with it the sense that it's moving through time over time. Because if something's stuck in time, it can't move through space. So as you move towards an object through space, you're moving towards that object over time, and the origin of your spatial point of view seems to be moving both through space towards the object and moving over time. So when you seem to be moving closer to an object that you seem to perceive, there's apparent change in the temporal location of the origin of your conscious point of view, as well as apparent change in the spatial location of the origin of your conscious point of view. So that introduces the idea of a changing temporal point of view. The thought is there can be apparent change in the temporal location of your conscious point of view, even when there isn't any apparent change in the spatial location of the origin of your conscious point of view. So even when you're sitting perfectly still and not moving, there can be apparent change in the temporal location of the origin of your conscious point of view, your temporal point of view. So you not only seem to occupy a conscious spatial point of view on your immediate spatial environment, you also seem to occupy a conscious temporal point of view on your immediate temporal environment. What I mean by your immediate temporal environment is your immediate future and your immediate past. And it's that apparent change in the temporal location of your conscious point of view that provides for the sense in which the end of the talk seems to be getting closer and closer, and the beginning of the talk seems to be getting further and further away. Shall I pause there?
Sure. 那前面的部分主要是从形而上学的方面来讲，我们不能在时间之中移动，但是在这里就提到一个现象学上的观察，这个观察同样也会基于我们的有意识的空间视角来进行说明。当我们在看一个东西的时候，我们会感觉到自己有一个占据一个空间位置，然后这个空间位置是我们的空间视角的起点。那我们还可以通过走近去看、走远去看来改变我们的空间视角。那与此同时呢，当我们在空间中移动的时候，通常会花一定的时间，这也就意味着我们同时也在时间之中移动，所以就可以以一种类比的方式提出，我们不仅有意识的空间视角，而且有意识的时间视角。所以， 那有意识的时间视角是有意识的时间视角，使得我们觉得讲座的终点离我们越来越近。那什么是一个有意识的时间视角呢？一个有意识的时间视角，那有意识的时间视角是，说当我们清醒然后有意识的时候，在这个时候我们也具有了一个时间视角的起点，然后这个时间视角的起点，我们可以通过，我们所具有的心理的朝向性，朝向它的就这个当前的 present 的前边一点的过去和它的未来，所以把这个过去、现在、未来这样的一个组合，我们会把它叫做 immediate temporal environment。那恰恰是我们所具有的这个有意识的时间视角的位置的变化，使得我们产生了刚才那种感觉。
Okay, thank you. So I want to now say a little bit more about this idea of a temporal point of view that I have in mind. So when you're awake, you occupy a conscious temporal point of view that has an origin. And as I'm thinking of it, the origin of your conscious temporal point of view is the experienced present. So from the origin of your conscious temporal point of view, you're psychologically oriented to temporal regions beyond the experienced present. So temporal regions that lie in your future, your immediate future, as well as temporal regions that lie in your immediate past. So here I'm not saying that you perceive things that lie in the temporal regions beyond the present, but I'm talking not about perceptual consciousness here, but time consciousness. So in the diagram, you see the origin is the experience present, and part of the idea is that you can't help but have psychological orientation to your immediate past and immediate future, although you're not perceiving those regions when you're conscious. And the psychological states that orient you to temporal regions beyond your experience present orient you to those temporal regions in asymmetrical ways. So for example, the way you're psychologically oriented towards the future relative to the past is relevant to the way in which the future seems to be open in the way that the past isn't, relevant to the way you anticipate the future but not the past, you wait for the future but not the past, you plan for the future and not the past, and so on. So the way in which you're psychologically oriented toward the moment of time when you experience that moment as temporally present depends on these asymmetric ways in which you're psychologically oriented to your immediate past and your immediate future. And as I'm thinking of it, the experience present is experienced by you as temporarily present, insofar as it's experienced as falling between your immediate past and your immediate future. And I'm suggesting it's apparent change in the temporal location of the origin of your conscious temporal point of view that provides for the sense in which the end of the talk seems to be getting closer and closer, and the beginning of the talk seems to be getting further and further away. Should I pause at that point?
Yeah. 这里是对时间视角的一个更多的阐明。那什么叫做一个时间视角呢？时间视角是说，当我们睁开眼睛醒来的时候，我们会有一个有意识的时间视角，它有一个原初的起点。那我们把它叫做经验的当下 experience 的 present。那同时，这个时间的视角，它具有一个心理朝向性，我们总是不能够停止，让它会对这个时间视角，它会超出 当前，然后朝向过去或者展望未来，哪怕当我们在面对同一个知觉对象的时候，也会发生这样的问题。所以在这里需要区分的是，时间意识并不等同于知觉意识，也就是我们可能面对同一个知觉对象，并没有超出这个我们的意识没有超出这个对象之外，但是时间意识它超出了经验的当下，朝向过去和未来。那我们也会把经验的当下，当它落入immediate past、immediate future 的时候，把它叫做是时间上的当下。所以正是这样的一种时间视角的变化，使得我们产生了我们离讲座的开始越来越远，离讲座的结束越来越近的感觉。
Thank you very much. Okay. So here's a challenge to the idea that the conscious temporal point of view seems to be changing. Not an objection, but a challenge, an explanatory challenge that it faces. A series of different temporal points of view on an event, each of which has an origin with a different temporal location, won't suffice for the experience of a changing temporal point of view on that event. So remember, I'm trying to capture here what's involved in the experience of an event in the future seeming to get closer and closer. So we're after the experience of a changing temporal point of view. The thought is a sequence of temporal points of view at different temporal locations won't suffice for that. This is related to the idea that a succession of experiences won't suffice for an experience of succession. So what more needs to be added to provide for the sense in which one seems to occupy a changing temporal point of view over time? Now, I suggest there's an assumption behind that challenge. And the assumption is this. Any apparent change in the temporal location of the origin of your conscious point of view will ultimately need to be explained in terms of a series of conscious points of view, each of which has an origin that doesn't change its temporal location. And that's an assumption we might question. Because if you never seem to occupy a conscious temporal point of view with an origin that doesn't seem to be changing its temporal location, then we can't legitimately expect your experience over time to be explicable in terms of a series of such experiences. In which case, the question of what needs to be added to those experiences doesn't arise. So I'm saying here that the challenge that the view faces rests on the assumption that we do occupy static conscious points of view, where those are conscious points of view with a temporal location that doesn't seem to change. And if we question that assumption, so we think we never seem to occupy a conscious temporal point of view with an origin that doesn't seem to change, then we shouldn't expect to analyze experience over time in terms of a series of static conscious temporal points of view. But what grounds can be offered for thinking that we never seem to occupy a conscious temporal point of view with an origin that doesn't seem to be changing its temporal location? That's what I'll consider next, but maybe I should pause again there.
所以基于刚才对于时间的具有一个原初的起点的时间视角的观点，那它总是对应于一个experience 的 present 经验的当下。那我们会会有这样的一个挑战是，哪怕已经有了很多个具有一个原初的起点的时间视角，但是仍然不足以说明时间视角的 变化是如何发生的。所以在这里似乎就有一个任务是我们要在具有原初起点的时间视角，以及有很多个这样的时间视角，并且它们是一个序列之外，还要再增添其他的条件，使得时间视角的变化成为可能。但是呢，这样的一个挑战的提出，实际上是基于一个预设，这个预设是说，我们的确占有一个它不会，我们的确具有一个有着原初的起点的时间视角，然后我们也会有很多个这样的视角构成了一个系列。可是这样的一个前提是值得被质疑的。如果这个前提是有问题的，我们就不需要面临要增加一个另外的条件，使得时间视角的变化成为可能的这样的一个挑战。那么我们为什么能够质疑时间？我们具有那些不会改变它的时空位置，然后有着原初起点的时间视角这个观点就是我们质疑它的理由是什么呢？那接下来会回答这个问题。
Thank you very much. So now I want to consider what grounds can be offered for thinking that we never seem to occupy a conscious temporal point of view with an origin that doesn't seem to be changing its temporal location. And I'm going to start by sketching out an argument, and then I'm going to go into some of these ideas in more detail. So here's the line of thought in outline. In order to characterize the sort of conscious temporal point of view you occupy, we need to specify what kinds of entities your conscious point of view seems to be a conscious point of view upon. And whenever you're wakefully conscious, you seem to occupy a conscious point of view on change. And to occupy a conscious point of view on change is to occupy a conscious point of view that seems to be changing, because it's to occupy a conscious temporal point of view with an origin that seems to be changing its temporal location. So here a suggestion is being made about, if you remember at the beginning of the talk, I said I'm interested in the relation between what it is to occupy a conscious temporal point of view on change and what it is to occupy a changing conscious temporal point of view. And here the suggestion is to occupy a conscious temporal point of view on change is to occupy a changing conscious temporal point of view. But that line of thought is going to depend on an assumption about change, a certain kind of conception of what change is, which I now want to say something about. So it rests on the following conception of change. The idea that change is an occurrence. It's something that happens. It's a happening. And the idea that the category of occurrence is fundamental and irreducible. So here the thought is there are objects which have properties, and in addition there are occurrences, things that happen, and occurrences are not reducible to objects having properties at time. And here's a further claim that's part of this conception of change. Occurrences with temporal extension fill time in a distinctive manner. They have different temporal parts that unfold successively over time and take time to unfold. So let me give an example. So take the example of spatial movement. When you watch an object moving from one side of a room to another, you seem to be conscious of an occurrence, something that's happening, which is the movement. The journey of the object seems to unfold over time successively and take time to unfold. So it seemed to take time for the object to move from one side of the room to another, and it also seemed to take time to be conscious of the object moving from one side of the room to the other. And the distinctive manner in which an occurrence fills an interval of time can't simply be captured by specifying states of affairs at times, where each such state of affairs doesn't mention an occurrence that unfolds over time and takes time to unfold. So if we attempt to reduce an object's spatial movement to the notion of its occupation of different spatial locations at different times, where each of those state of affairs doesn't invoke the idea of an occurrence that unfolds over time and takes time to unfold, then something's lost, something's been left out. And that's the occurrence, that's the movement. Because on this view, the occurrence as a change in spatial location is fundamental and irreducible. So according to this view, there are particular instants of time and particular spatial locations at which an object is moving, only insofar as there's an interval of time occupied by an occurrence with temporal extension. So say an occurrence which is the movement of the object where that movement unfolds over time. Now we can apply that idea to the notion of temporal movement. The thought is that the movement of an object through time is an occurrence. What's distinctive of an object's movement through time as an occurrence is the manner in which it fills an interval of time, so the way in which its occupation of time, understood as its movement through time, unfolds successively over time and takes time to unfold. And the thought is that can't be captured by simply specifying states of affairs at times where each such state of affairs doesn't mention an occurrence that unfolds over time. So on this view, there are particular instants of time at which the object is moving through time, only insofar as there's an interval of time occupied by an occurrence with temporal extension, where that occurrence is the movement of the object through time. That movement of the object through time unfolds over time. And that's how we should understand the object's occupation of an interval of time. So if we think back to the challenge to the possibility of temporal movement, if you remember it went like this. If an object occupies a past temporal location, then it never vacates that temporal location. And if an object never vacates any temporal location that it occupies, then an object can't occupy different times by moving in its entirety from one temporal location to another. So now, with this notion of change and this understanding of temporal movement, we can say the following in response to that challenge. This amounts to an effective objection to the idea that objects move through time only if we assume that objects occupy intervals of time in virtue of occupying instants of time that fall within that interval. And the response is to identify a temporal location that the object occupies is to identify an interval of time over which it moves through time, or an instant of time that falls within an interval of time over which it moves through time. And we can accept that an occurrence that is an object's movement through time can't change its temporal location. The occurrence can't change its temporal location. But that provides no reason for thinking that the object, which thereby moves through time, doesn't in fact move through time. So it provides no reason for thinking that the object doesn't change its temporal location.
我们要回答刚才的问题是为什么可以说我们没有占据一个具有起点的不能够改变它的时间位置的时间视角。那大概的想法是这样的，我们可以通过去说明我们的意识的视角以什么东西为对象，就是来通过说明它的意识对象来说明它可能具有什么样的特征。那每当我们具有清醒的意识的时候，我们好像都占据了关于变化的 意识视角。那这个关于变化的意识视角，也就意味着我们占据了一个在变化着的意识视角。所以就回到我们最初要解决的问题是，就是前面提到第一个和第二个问题呢，这里的回答是我们所具有的关于变化的视角，就是一个在变化着的意识视角。那要理解这一点呢，基于我们对于change 或者说变化的一个重新的理解，就是我们在这里会把它理解成是一个在发生的事情，是一个 occurrence。那这个 occurrence 它本身是基本的，是不可还原的，它不能够被比如说它不能还原为在这一个时间段里边的存在的那个对象的一些性质的改变。所以我们在这里会区分具有性质的对象和occurrence。那 occurrence 它除了是基本的不可还原的，它还具有一个特征是它会逐渐的在时间之中展开，或者说它的展开是需要一定的时间的。同时，它也不能够被还原为是那些在特定的时间点发生的特定的事态 （state of affairs）。反过来，我们所具有的关于特定时间发生的事态是，通过理解 occurrence 来得到界定的。比如说，以空间中的移动为例子，我们会把一个事物从 A 移动到 B 的这样的一个移动叫做是一个 occurrence。那么它在每一个时间点上发生了什么，是通过说明 occurrence 这个移动的过程来得到界定的。那这一点我们也会把它应用到对于时间位置的变化的说明，也就是说，我们不是有一个占据了特定时间位置的不能够再移动的时间视角，然后把它们加起来来说明 occurrence 或者说是时间视角的变化，而是我们会以occurrence 为一个形而上学上基本的东西来才能够去界定那些在特定的时间位置上的视角。所以我们会回复到最初的前面的那个观点，是一个东西它会占据一个不能够改变它的位置的原初的时间视角。那这个观点是有问题的，就是基于我们对于 occurrence 的理解，它是有问题的。那么我们能够基于 occurrence 来说明时间视角的变化，同时occurrence 作为发生的事情本身，它会占据一段的时间，但是它不需要在时间之中有变化。
So that discussion of change and occurrence is supposed to help provide a response to the following assumption. The assumption that we do occupy a conscious spatial point of view that's static. So it's supposed to support the idea, help support the idea that we never seem to occupy a conscious temporal point of view with an origin that doesn't seem to be changing its temporal location. So let me explain how that's supposed to work. So let's assume that conception of change that I outlined. So a change is an occurrence, and the category of occurrence is fundamental and irreducible. An occurrence with temporal extension unfolds over time and takes time to unfold. And such occurrence includes an object's occupation of an interval of time, understood as an object's movement through time. So now we can construct the following line of thought. Whenever you occupy a conscious point of view, you seem to occupy a temporal point of view on entities, objects, and occurrences that occupy intervals of times and you seem to occupy a temporal point of view on their occupation of an interval of time. So what this is saying is that you never seem to be conscious of just an instantaneous temporal part of an event. I mean by instantaneous, literally no temporal extension at all. And you never seem to be conscious of an object for just occupying just an instant and not an interval of time. That's simply a phenomenological claim. The interval occupying entities that you seem to be conscious of, objects and occurrences, seem to be entities that take time to occupy any interval of time. So even if an object that you're perceiving seems to be staying still, it seems to take time for it to stay in that position. If you're conscious of an occurrence when you're conscious, whenever you're conscious, then what you experience as present when you're conscious will include occurrence. So remember, I'm thinking of occurrence as something that fills time by unfolding over time. So since an occurrence fills time by unfolding over time, then to be conscious of occurrence as present is to be conscious of occurrence as falling in and out of the experience present. So it's unfolding over time. So the experienced present seems to be something it's falling in and out of as it unfolds over time. Your consciousness of occurrence falling in and out of the experience present will involve apparent change in your temporal orientation to occurrences that fall in and out of the experience present. So if something's just seems to have gone out of the experience into the immediate past, then your psychological temporal orientation to that bit of the event has changed because it now seems to be in the immediate past. Since an occurrence can't change its temporal location, that will thereby involve apparent change in your temporal orientation to temporal locations. So the temporal location that fell within the present now seems to be in the immediate past. So that apparent change in temporal orientation to temporal location will result in apparent change in the temporal location of the origin of your temporal point of view. So to occupy a temporal point of view on entities that seem to take time to occupy an interval of time is to occupy a temporal point of view with an origin, the temporal location of which seems to be changing. So that was the conclusion we're after. So whenever you occupy a conscious point of view, you seem to occupy a temporal point of view with an origin, the temporal location of which seems to be changing. There's one final question to ask here, though. So that's given some suggestion about the respect in which it seemed as though the end of the talk is getting closer and closer. The origin of your conscious temporal point of view seems to be changing. And I'm suggesting that whenever you're conscious, you occupy a conscious temporal point of view, the origin of which seems to be changing. But we might ask, are you really getting closer to the end of the talk, or do you only seem to be? Are you really traveling through time, or is any kind of apparent temporal movement a mere illusion? I'm going to talk about that in the final part of the talk, but I should pause there.
所以基于我们刚才对基于用 occurrence 来理解 change， 那我们会有怎么样的进一步的推进？首先，那 occurrence 它具有的特点，我们刚才说过是它是基本的不可还原的，但是它是有一个时间上的延展，它会在时间之中展开。那基于这样的观点，每当我们占据一个意识视角，并且这个意识视角它以特定的对象 或者说是 object 或者 occurrence 为对象的时候，那 occurrence 它本身是有一个时间间隔，它会在时间中展开。那一个 object 哪怕它只是静止的待在那个地方，它也需要一些时间或者一个时间段来只是停留在那里。所以我们会以一个有时间段或者说时间间隔的东西为意识视角的对象。这后面是什么？但是这个意识视角就是这个对象，它本身是占据了一个时间段，但是它自己不会在时间之中，变化。所以我们怎么样来讲这个 occurrence 这样的一个有时间延展的东西和 present 之间的关系？我们会说这个 occurrence 它会进入或者走出 experience 的 present，它会进入或者走出经验的当下。那既然这个 occurrence 它会有和 present 有这样的关系，同时它自己又不会在时间之中移动，所以对它的一个说明是，是视角，时间的视角是会发生，是会改变它的心理的朝向的，或者说是它的时间的朝向性。所以正是这一点解释了我们最开始要说的，对于这个演讲来说，我离它的起点越来越远，离它的终点越来越近。那接下来的一个问题是说，我们认为离终点越来越近的这个东西，它是一个实际上真实存在的，它是一个事实，还是说它仅仅这种时间上的移动仅仅是一种错觉？
Shall I carry on?
Okay,
So yeah, we really are getting close to the end of the talk because this is the final section now. So I have these questions. Are you really traveling through time, or is that just an illusion? Are you really getting closer to the end of the talk, or do you only seem to be? And I think the answer to these questions are going to depend in part on whether we accept the view of occurrence that I previously outlined. And I didn't argue for that view of change and occurrences. I just defined it, characterized it. So I want to now consider an objection to that view of occurrence. So this is a challenge to the view that occurrence is irreducible. It starts with the thought that we occupy a temporal perspective from which events are in our future, events are in our present, events are in our past, and this amounts to a tenth perspective on reality. And over time, we occupy tense perspectives on reality that are incompatible with one another. So if I'm anticipating some event in the future, if I have a perspective on it as in the future, that's incompatible with having a perspective on it as present and having a perspective on it as past. So those tense perspectives on the event are incompatible with one another. But we should avoid the mistake of taking what's incompatible in these temporal perspectives on reality to be incompatible features of the reality they're perspectives on. So I could have a perspective on the computer screen where it's to my left, and a perspective on the computer screen from which it's to my right. But we don't think these are incompatible features possessed by the computer screen being both left and right. So we shouldn't confuse what's incompatible with each perspective on the screen with incompatible features of reality. And the same applies with temporal perspectives. So occupying incompatible perspectives on reality doesn't amount to being aware of incompatible features of reality. And now we might think, look, wherever and whenever there are conscious beings sufficiently like us, there are apparently changing temporal points of view on reality. and no such temporal point of view is metaphysically privileged. So just as my conscious spatial point of view is not metaphysically privileged in any way relative to your conscious spatial point of view, the conscious temporal point of view I'm having now isn't metaphysically privileged relative to someone who lived 1,000 years ago. So in order to attain the correct view of what there really is, we need to arrive at a conception of reality that transcends each and every one of these apparently changing temporal points of view. And that requires attaining a conception of reality that goes beyond, encompasses, and so includes all these different apparently changing temporal points of view, including the changing points of view that exist 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years in the future, and so on. And to do that is to adopt a view of reality sub specie eternitatis, which means under the aspect of eternity. So this is a view of reality that's not from any changing temporal point of view. It's a changeless view of reality. And that changeless view of reality doesn't include irreducible occurrence. So why doesn't that changeless view of reality include irreducible occurrence? Well, the idea of an occurrence with temporal extension that unfolds over time and takes time to unfold is suggestive of the idea that an occurrence with temporal extension has its being in becoming. So this is a very familiar ancient idea. So here's Aristotle in the Physics. He says, existence is said of many things in many ways, and one such way is the way a day or a competition exists, namely through one thing coming into being after another. According to the view of reality sub specie eternitatis, from the view of eternity, the different temporal parts of an occurrence don't literally come to be successively because they don't literally come into existence at all. They don't literally come into existence any more than they literally go out of existence. For it's a tenseless truth that each temporal part of an occurrence, such as a journey from one side of the room to another, is when it is, and it's a tenseless truth that the whole journey is when it is. So the journey doesn't come into or out of existence over time, and nor does your experience of it. So that appearance, that's to say the appearance that things come into existence, they unfold over time, they take time to unfold, is mere illusion, according to this line of thought. And that's why we should reject the non-reductive account of occurrence in favor of the reductive account of change. So according to that reductive account, your apparently changing temporal point of view, as well as the apparent change that it seems to be a changing temporal point of view upon, must ultimately be accounted for without appealing to a irreducible occurrence, something that comes into being successively over time. Now, here's a response. So just to recap, that was a challenge to the idea that there really is irreducible occurrence. And I've suggested that whether or not there really is irreducible occurrence is relevant to the question of whether temporal movement is mere illusion, seeming to get closer to the end of the talk, whether that's mere illusion. And here's a response to that worry about irreducible occurrence. So I mentioned there are philosophical traps that I think we should avoid. One of the traps we should be wary of is the assumption that an attempt to transcend each and every conscious point of view in order to attain a comprehensive and complete view of what there is can ever succeed in including all there is. So this is related to something that Michael Dummett said, writing about McTaggart on the unreality of time. Dummett said that the trap is our prejudice that there must be a complete description of reality. So if we attempt to attain a conception of reality that transcends and encompasses each and every changing conscious temporal point of view, we leave behind and so omit part of what is real. The irreducible occurrence that is a changing temporal point of view, and the irreducible occurrence that a changing temporal point of view is a point of view upon. The question, I'm suggesting the question of whether you really are moving through time or whether that's mere illusion is going to depend in part on whether we think that it's possible to provide a complete description of reality by transcending every point of view, every conscious point of view, and trying to include and encompass all there is. The thought here in response is that that's going to leave something behind. It's going to leave behind real things such as irreducible occurrence and our changing temporal point of view, which is a temporal point of view upon them. And that's related to a thought that one finds in Thomas Nagel in The View from Nowhere, where he writes, we can pursue a unified, if very etiolated conception of reality by detaching progressively from our own point of view. We just have to keep in mind what we're leaving behind and not be fooled into thinking we have made it disappear. And that's the final part. Thank you.
Thank you. 那最后一部分是对于刚才的问题的回答，就是我们认为有时间移动它是现实还是仅仅是一个错觉？那回答这个问题其实依赖于我们怎么样看待刚才提到的 irreducible occurrence， 就是不可还原的发生的事情。那下面就是给出了一个对它的可能的反驳，因为刚才其实只是给出了一些定义和描述它的特征，所以这个反驳是说，我们好像通常会接纳一种对于关于现实的有时间性的视角的理解，比如说我们会有朝向未来的视角、朝向现在的视角和过去的视角，那这些视角之间是不能相互兼容的，它们是有时态的，但是呢我们采纳这样的有时态的视角，并不意味着现实本身它具有不可兼容的特征，那现实本身它仍然还是融贯的，所以在这里可能就要求我们要知道什么是 reality， 什么是真的，似乎就要超越有时态的，然后呢有相对性的意识的视角，从而获得一个能够包含所有的视角，能够超越视角的相对性的一个现实。那这个现实可能最终得出来的就是现实，它是永恒的，它没有时间性，当然它也不会是有时态性的、有相互冲突的特征。可是我们关于这个 reality 的理解是不能够容纳前面提到的 irreducible occurrence， 因为这个 occurrence 它作为一个发生之事，就意味着它是需要时间来生成。那在这个观点呢，它会回复到亚里士多德在物理学里边的一个想法是，当一个东西它在生成的时候，它通常是有 come to be， 就是进入存在，然后不再存在。但是基于刚才的一个现实是永恒的这样的一个理解的话，我们是没有办法容纳存在 occurrence 这样的事物，所以基于这样的理解，只能说时间的移动是一个显现出来的错觉。但是对这样的一个观点的一个可能的回应是， 这里我们可能犯了一个形而上学的，我们可能落入了一个形而上学的陷阱，是我们要超越所有的视角，从而知道现实是什么，以获得一个对它的一个完全的描述。这个描述它是超越于视角，涵盖了一切的视角，它本身不具有视角性的。但是这样的观点可能是有问题的。那这个观点呢，它也会得到我们比较熟悉的内格尔的一个反驳。这里是说我们可能当我们去追求一个对于现实的理解的时候，我们会逐步的一点一点脱离自己占有的视角。但是呢，这并不意味着我们能使得这个视角消失，我们只是离它更远而已。所以，当我们采纳一个刚才所说的现实是永恒的，是超越视角的这样的观点的时候，可能会遗落下一些实际上也是真实存在的东西，比如说occurrence，比如说使得它可能会使得它就是没有办法包含occurrence以及我们刚才论证的视角的时间视角的变化。And I hope there isn't something wrong in my translation. And thanks very much for your insightful and impressive talk. So,
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Next, it's time to give response. And 那首先就由刘畅老师来做回应。
Okay. Thank you very much for Professor Soteriel's enlightening talk. I personally very appreciate your occurrence conception of change. I really look forward for another opportunity. Perhaps you can now develop this conception more for us. So now I have some questions. So perhaps I can also here to share. Okay. In Professor Suter's discussion on temporal perspective, I think his discussion is largely based on the analogy between time and space. So, but to me, I think one need to be asked in the first place is perhaps to what extent are time and space as well as changes in time and changes in space analogous, or in what aspects might they be non-analogous? 我刚才就是首先给这个Soteriel 教授提的一个问题是这样子的，就是我们可以看到刚才在 Soteriel 教授的这个讲演中呢，他的很多的关于这个时间的讨论，实际上是基于时间与空间的这个一个类比关系的。所以呢，我的问题首先是想问说，当我们去类比时间和空间的时候，我们首先要问的一个问题是不是说，就是这两者在多大程度上是可类比的？然后在多大程度上又是不可类比的，因为它究竟是两种不同的这个有待讨论的问题。接下来，for example, so in the first argument, the elliptic argument as a target argument. So such kind of argument is given such like this. The first premise is you can never locate any temporal location that you occupy. And the second premise is if you can never locate any temporal location that you occupy, you cannot move through time. And based on the two premises, the conclusion is you cannot move through time. Given that such reasoning is true, is valid. So I think the question is, we can understand such kind of reasoning from two directions. We can use either models, opponents to say that if 1 and 2 are both true, then 3 is true. But we can also use modus tollens, and we can infer that if 1 is true and 3 is false, then 2 is false. And I think why we assume the second premise is true. If you can never locate any temporal location that you occupy, you cannot move through time. Perhaps there's behind this, there's also a kind of analogous argument or reasoning between time and space. So when we talk about movement through space, I think it's reasonable to say that if you can never locate any spatial location that you occupy, you cannot move through space. And plus another premise, which is movement through time is analogous with movement through space. And from that, we can perhaps infer that if you can never locate any temporal location that you occupy, you cannot move through time. But the question is, what if I would rather deny the analogy between time and space, which is here the second premise, right? OK， 所以我先提出来的第一个问题是，像是说，就是在那个Soterial 教授他的这个讲座的起点，作为一个起点的一个论证，他首先呢，提到了一个就是艾利亚学派式的这样的一种否定，有这个时间中的运动啊，有这样的一个论证。在这个论证中呢，他特别要强调的一个重点是说，假如我们不能先把这个我们曾经所占有的、所占据的那个时间位置腾空的话，假如从来不能腾空我们曾经占有的那个时间位置的话，那么呢，我们就不可能在时间中有这个运动啊。那么呢，我的问题是这样的，就是说，当然呢，你可以首先呢，先肯定这样一个前提，然后说呢 ，OK， 我曾经假如说占有了某一个时间位置，那么就像Soterial 教授所强调的，那么呢，这个过去已经发生的这个事情已经是事实了啊，那么我曾经占有的这个时间位置，我也从来不可能真正把它腾空啊。那么假定如此，那么呢，我觉得仍然可以有两种不同的结论。一个结论呢是说，那么呢，我接受这个前提，于是得出结论说呢，那 OK， 既然我从来不可能腾空时间位置，所以呢，我也就不可能真正完成在时间之中的这样的一种移动。 这是一种可能的结论。但另外一个结论呢是这样的，就是呢，我们先肯定，我们认为呢，就是显然我们是可以在时间中移动的。比如说，就像 Soteriel 教授提到的那样的一个例子，是吧？当我现在进行这样的一个评论的时候，随着时间的推移，那么呢，我以及我们都会离这个评论或者这件事情的那个终点越来越近啊。假如说我们不会否认这样的一个最基本的事实，那么反而需要被质疑的就变成了说前面的那个前提了：为什么我们在时间中的移动一定要以清空我曾经占据的那个时间位置作为前提呢？对吧？反而是这个需要被质疑了。那所以呢，就是我们会看到呢，实际上我们之所以认定这样一个前提呢，背后基于的是一个时间与空间的类比啊。那我们讨论这个在空间中的移动的时候，那么 Soteriel 教授强调说，假如你从一个空间位置移动到另外一个空间位置，那么一个必要的前提是你必须不能同时占有这两个空间位置啊。你是比如说你坐在1号座，那么呢，你先得从1号座起来啊，腾空了这个1号座，你再坐到2号座上，这才是代表了你在空间中的一个真正的位移，是吧？那么你按照这样的一个逻辑来讲的话，在时间中完成的这个位移也得遵循相同的逻辑，但是前提是什么呢？是在空间中完成的位移和时间中完成的位移，它们是可类比的。但是问题在于说，假如说在时间和空间这两种不同介质里面完成的这个位移是两种完全不同逻辑的东西，对吧？那么呢，似乎那么这个可类比性就值得被质疑了。Okay, let me continue. But we can draw back and we assume that there is some analogy, some real analogy between time and space. So when we talk about movement through space, so we can say that the spatial location I occupy now is different from the spatial location I previously occupied. Therefore, I've vacated the spatial location I occupied. Just as Professor Soteriel's example, I move from this corner to another corner in my room. So now I'm in this corner, and previous, I occupied another corner. So you can see during the movement through space, I vacated the spatial location I occupied. But we can also make another analogy. So we can look at the case of movement through time. So we can ask the temporal location I occupy now, whether it is different from the temporal location I previously occupied. I think the answer is also yes, right? Therefore, we can also say that I've located the temporal location I occupied. For example, yesterday I was, I don't know, I was and we was on December 6th, and today is December 7th, right? So the temporal location I occupy or you occupy is already different, right? From earlier. So I think perhaps the question is okay. Just I try to translate. 那么所以呢，我刚才提到了一个问题，就是关于我们需不需要以腾空这个时间位置作为我们在时间中位移的前提。那么接下来呢，我想进一步要问的问题是说，假定我们呢的确就需要以腾空时间位置作为我们在时间中移动的位移的这个前提。那么呢，我们先看在空间中的移动。那么呢，我们怎么来判断我们是不是已经腾空了我们的时间位置？比如说，我现在呢从这儿走到了这儿，对吧？ 那么呢，我现在所占有的这个空间位置就不同于我刚才所占有的那个空间位置了，对吧？那么在这个意义上来讲，我现在呢就已经腾空了我之前所占有的那个空间位置啊，这就满足了在空间中位移的前提了。但是呢，我们假如看我占有的这个时间位置，那么今天呢，比如说我占有的是周六啊，12月7号这样的一个时间位置，那么昨天呢，我占有的是12月6号。是吧？昨天的这样的一个时间位置，那么今天我是不是仍然能够占有昨天我所在的那个时间位置呢？今天我到底在的这个日期是12月7号，今天还是12月6号？昨天呢，当然是12月7号啊。那在这个意义上来讲呢，哪怕我们现在以腾空时间位置作为我在时间中移动的前提，那么呢，至少在大量的例子里面啊，然后至少有一种理由让我们说呢，我们同样也以相同的可类比的方式腾空了我们之前所占据的时间位置，是吧？那所以你假如说仍然以这个腾空时间位置作为前提的话，似乎也不会造成说，一开始会提出这样一个问题，就是说我们在时间中的位移是如何可能的呢？对吧？就是这个问题似乎根本就提不出来的。Okay, and I think from another aspect, we can also say that there should be some difference between the so-called movement through time. Yeah, just as Professor Soterios in his talk mentioned and defined, and time travel, right? That's another difficult question in time in philosophy of time, right? I think the answer to this question would also indicate some significant difference between movements through time and movements through space. So use another analogy or a metaphor. I seem to be strapped to a time track and move with it, right? I cannot just travel through time, at any direction as I will, right? 就是这个地方呢，当然就是还有一个问题，就是当我们讨论到在时间中移动或者在时间中旅行的时候，那么呢，当然我们知道，就是说我们谈到的说，就是我们现在离这个讲座的终点越来越近，越来越近，是吧？在这种意义上，我们在时间中的移动，显然呢是和我们在空间中的移动是有所不同的。比如说在空间中移动呢，我们是可以在任意的方向上去移动的。是吧？原则上来讲是这个样子，只要是在空间中允许的任何的一个相应的一个空间位置啊，那么原则上来讲，我总是可以去到这个位置上去占有这个位置的。但是我们发现呢，这个所谓的时间旅行是吧，就不是这个样子，它就更像是说一个人呢被绑在了一个时间的履带上，对吧？它是动不了的，对吧？因为我们讨论的这个在时间中移动，我们讨论的不是这个时间穿越，是吧？我们讨论的不是穿越剧，对不对？So now I would like to focus on the sixth premise in the so-called eleatic argument, which is any spatial temporal location that is occupied by any part of your life is a spatial temporal location that is occupied by you. My question is, why should we accept this premise in the first place? I mean, the question is there a significant difference between object and process? A process which is like a basketball game, it can be divided into different temporal parts. But an object, for example, a basketball court, can only be reasonably divided into spatial parts. For example, a basketball game can be can include its first half and second half. But on the contrary, a basketball court can only be divided into its front court and back court, not the other way around. So when we see basketball player, do we see merely the first half, the basketball player in the first half of the basketball game? I don't think so. When we introduce a person like me, yeah, what you introduce, the full me or the front part of me or only one, I don't know, 30 thousandths of me, because I mean each one has some 30,000 day to live, right? So I think it's question. I know that there's many debate between produrentism and endurantism, but okay, I think just based on common sense, I think it's perhaps more reasonable to defend a kind of anti-produrentism step. OK， 所以接下来我要讨论这个问题呢，是说就是在这个一开始，就是 Soteriel 教授提出的这个一系列的这个论证中呢，其中有一个第6点的前提，这点前提呢，在整个论证中是非常关键的啊，要得出来，不可能存在时间中的移动这样一个结论。那么这个前提是怎么得出来的呢？就是大概是这样的，就是就我的生命来讲的话呢，我曾经占有的时间位置啊，比如说我昨天呢就占有了一个昨天的这样的一个时间位置啊，而过去的事情，我们假定说没有这个时间旅行啊，那么是无可改变了。那所以呢，假如说我昨天的确占有了这样一个时间位置了，那么呢，这个时间位置就构成了的我生命旅程中不可改变的一个部分。但问题在于说呢，就是构成我生命的一部分的东西，是不是就构成了我的一部分啊？那么一个6岁的刘畅啊，一个我的童年，当然呢是构成了我整个生命的一个部分，但是呢，那个6岁的刘畅，是不是构成了我的一部分？还是说呢，我呢就是整个的从过去，变到了现在。那么，当我现在比如说有人去介绍我的时候啊，就是介绍一个人啊，那么呢，你介绍的是一个整个的人，还是说呢，你看到的是我的这个前半部分，还是说呢，你看到的是我的那个30万分之一啊？因为呢，我们说大概一个人，假如说有30万天可以活的话。那么你按照一种那个四维蠕虫的那样的一种想象的话，那么我们从来是不可能看到一个完整的人的，是吧？我们假如只给一个人的话，我们顶多也是看到今天的他，看到这个30万分之一的那个他。但是我觉得呢，这个就比较奇怪，是吧？因为我们有必要区分这个对象和过程。那么呢，我作为一个人，作为一个个体啊，人类个体，我是一个对象啊，放在这个落在对象这个范畴下。而这个我的生命呢，我的一生呢，是适合放到这个过程的范畴下。所以就是比如说一个篮球赛啊，可以分成前半场跟后半场，上半场跟下半场啊。但是一个篮球场呢，可以分成是前半场跟后半场啊，而不是把它反过来，是吧？那么比如说我们在这个比赛的前半场，我们看到了一个篮球运动员的时候。啊，我们不是看到了这个篮球运动员的前半部分，是吧？然后到了后半场呢，再看到这个篮球运动员的后半部分，是吧？不是这样的一个逻辑。Okay, so another part is when we try to distinguish two
老
different
师，那
senses
个
of
您
occupation of
老师您还有就是比较多的
this is the last point. Yeah,
啊
yeah, different spatial location. And the question is, even we accept the glowing block model of time temporal existence. So there is perhaps another sense of getting closer to the end of the talk. That is just like a tree, as Professor Soterio suggested. Okay, I think, sorry, I take too much time.
谢谢刘畅老师。那我们之后是请第二位老师做回应。
Right. I'll skip this metaphysical stuff. We don't have time for this. I just jump to the main point. Actually, let me say I quite agree a lot with what Matt says today, but there's one thing I think is a little bit mysterious, and another thing is looks like unnecessary or maybe redundant. So first, I think the question to be asked is how change is perceived. And the initial difficulty in answering that question seems to be that, you know, as a kind of being we are, we need to start from somewhere in order to perceive change in the world. Actually, in order to perceive anything in the world, we need to start from somewhere. And that somewhere is called, by Might, is called the conscious point of view. And I think the concept, we can only be conscious of now. So probably that's why they also call it the point of view of experienced now. Okay, that's just a terminology. The starting point is experienced now. Then on the face of it, there's a problem if we want to starting from that point to perceive change in the world, because it looks like we can only perceive at any time. We can only perceive a single moment. That is, the moment is also now, I mean, in the world. So there's no change, because for any change to happen, we need to have at least two moments, right? Or two different state of affairs, but we have only one to be perceived. So that's a difficulty. And to solve this difficulty, I think Matt's suggestion is that we have an alternative picture of what is going on here. That's this, right? We're not pinpointing to a single moment. Instead, we perceive like a single moment, but still in a certain sense, we sense we are consciously oriented to other times in past or future, right? Maybe I can summarize the suggestion, essential point Might as the following, what I call spanning theory. That is, object is perceived to be changing in virtue of the fact that perceiver, from the standpoint of the appearance now, perceives not only the objects having a property now, but also sense or is psychologically oriented towards. It's not having that property in the immediate past, or it can sense or it is psychologically oriented towards. It's not having that property in the immediate future. I think the project, the theory is fun. I mean, it's doable at least. I wouldn't say it's promising. The reason I don't want to say it's promising is because I think the key term in this theory, that is the sense or is being psychologically oriented towards. That needs to be unpacked. Maybe it's not, you know, a problem within philosophy. Maybe we need to unpack by reference to some development in the in the neuroscience or something like that. But it's doable, I think. But still, there's a lot of things going on in these terms. So I think it needs to be clarified and need to be refined. Otherwise, it looks like a little bit mysterious, because, you know, the perception, okay, we can only perceive the moment now, but in some other sense, we are kind of psychologically oriented towards the in past or future. That sounds a little bit mysterious to me. That's one point. Another point is that Might spend a lot of time talking about the occurrence, but I don't see why that is important for this theory or this project. Because as long as we have this triangle on this picture, I think everything is done. I mean, all the heavy duties is done by the triangle structure, the perceptual sensation structure of this triangle. No matter whether we are perceiving or sense different moments of time individually or as a whole, that is as an occurrence, doesn't seem to be making any difference to the theory. So let's say if we insert this green bar into this picture, it doesn't matter. I mean, we don't need this green bar for that theory to work. So I don't think why we need that green bar, that occurrence, the notion occurrence. I mean, if I understand you rightly, it's just a so-called occurrence is just an event, non-spontaneous, spontaneous event. It's an event with a certain temporal extension. That's fine. Everybody would agree with that, but it doesn't matter for this spanning theory or this picture to work. So I don't think it's a necessary supposition. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
谢谢汤老师。那接下来是郑慧颖老师来给出评论。
Okay, let me.
Okay, I'll need to make sure the technology works. All right, for the interest of time, I will just go into the question directly. So I have 4 questions and I will summarize at the end. First one is about science and metaphysics. So at the beginning of the paper, Matt says that he will try to point to some of the traps that can prevent philosophers from acknowledging a certain view. So my gut reaction is, how about scientists? Isn't this the area where science and metaphysics intersect, if anything does? This is not to say that we should defer to the sciences, in particular physics, for the answer. Theoretical physics is constantly developing, and rivalry interpretations of the current physics tend to rely on metaphysical assumptions that are especially apt for philosophical reflections. So let me explain this in Chinese. 所以这是关于科学跟哲学的问题啊。当然我们都知道说时间哲学呢跟理论物理学非常有关系啊。那当然我可以明白说作者在他今天的重点并不是放在跟科学的交界啊，但这个只是一个邀请，或许他可以多说一点跟这个科学的考虑有关的关系。Then to the second one. So concerning the nature of time, there is a conceptual space shared by philosophers and scientists alike. So I will read through some views in the view about time. So durantism, objects have temporal parts. Endurantism, objects do not have temporal parts. 4-dimensionalism, objects have 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. 3-dimensionalism, objects have 3 spatial dimensions but no temporal dimensions. Unilocationism, objects can only occupy 1 temporal location. And multi-locationism, objects can occupy multiple temporal locations. Admittedly, labels and isms can gloss over subtleties, but they can be helpful sometimes. Given that Matt mentions pejoratism in passing in the paper, so maybe could you guide us through with these simplified categories? So normally, view 1, 3, and 5 would combine, and they will be opposing 2, 4, and 6. 所以用中文来说呢，就时间哲学里面有很多不同的看法。好，那这边列了6个，那有3个会结合在一起，另外3个会结合在一起。所以我只是邀请这个讲者，是不是可以用这个比较简化的方式呢，来帮我们摘要一下。Now move to the next one. Object as spatial temporal fillers. So this is kind of repetitive with the first one, the first commentator. So 4-dimensionalism seems to play a certain role in the narrative, as the analogy between time and space comes up often. In doing so, do we assume a Lockean or Newtonian conception of space? In particular, the idea that objects are space fillers seem to fit the bill, and there's some reference to the paper. So the broader question is, do we already need to have a view for the nature of space in order to carry on the narrative about time? perhaps this is not a problem, but it seems important for the readers to get clear. 所以基本上这个跟刘畅老师一开始的点很接近，所以我就不多说了。那接下来是我最后一点 ，the reality of time and colors. The metaphysics of time seems to have the same fate with the metaphysics of colors. Many, though not all, interpretations of the dominant theory of physics tend to imply that colors do not exist in the external world or do not exist at all. Philosophers, while respecting all the physical knowledge, tend to be quite rooted for the reality of colors. So what do you think about this analogy with colors? Does, for example, naive realism concerning perception play a significant, though perhaps rather hidden, role in the overall narrative? 所以这边只是在说，关于物理学呢，对颜色的看法跟时间的看法，好像对我们的尝试都有所威胁。那我只是邀请这个作者，或许再多谈一点他对知觉的看法，然后关于这个时间哲学跟颜色哲学的部分呢有所说明。那跟大家道个歉，就是我这边的状态不太好，所以或许有些噪音。好，那我的报告就在这。So I'll end here. Thank you very much.
谢谢郑老师。那接下来，那可以有请 Professor Matthew Soteriol give response to, like you can pick up several questions you are interested in and give response and maybe have further discussion.
Thank you so much for those excellent and very helpful comments. So let me go through in turn what I understood to be the main comments and questions. So starting with Lou's. So one thing to say is I'm in a way very sympathetic with the line of thought that I think you were pushing, which is, firstly, I agree with you that anti-pedurantism is a common sense view. And that's a position I want to agree with. And so, in effect, I'm trying to argue for, so remember that there are various traps that I think there are that I'm trying to avoid. And one of those traps is precisely the trap that leads to perdurantism as opposed to endurantism, and takes us away from that common sense view. And I agree with you entirely as well that the pedurantist picture makes it difficult to properly accommodate the distinction between object on the one hand and events and processes on the other. This now I think is connected with your diagnosis, as I understand it, of some of what's at issue here, which is whether going for a position like pedurantism somehow is spatializing time in a way that's inappropriate, or pushing too strong the analogy between space and time. And in effect, I think I agree with you on that point as well. And so part of what I'm trying to do in giving these responses to these traps is try to figure out, okay, where is it going wrong in these analogies between space and time? On the one hand, I think that there are certain analogies. So for example, I think just as there can be spatial locations, we can talk of temporal locations. I also think that just as we can talk about spatial movement, we can talk about temporal movement. There'll be big differences in each case, and particular differences between our temporal perspective and our spatial perspective. In the case of a spatial perspective, there are multiple dimensions. And in the case of a spatial perspective or point of view, I can exercise agency over my spatial location and move in different directions. And I can't exercise that kind of agency over my temporal movement. It seems like I'm stuck going forward in time. So there's some similarities and differences. What I think part of my suggestion is to really get to the bottom of some of those disanalogies is going to require getting the right conception of event and occurrence, where the event is something that not only occupies intervals of time, because there's a respect in which objects occupy intervals of time. So if we ask for the temporal, what's the temporal location of Descartes? So on the one hand, you might be a presentist who thinks the past doesn't exist. But if you're a realist about the past, what is Descartes' temporal location? Presumably, you might say from his birth to his death. And that's an interval of time. So I think we can talk about object occupying intervals of time. But the way that an event occupies an interval of time is different from the way an object does. So the way Descartes' life fills those years is different from the way that Descartes occupies that interval of time. The life unfolds over time and takes time to unfold. And the object, Descartes, is not the category of thing that unfolds over time and takes time to unfold. So part of what's required, I think, for getting the idea of taking time to unfold is the idea that temporal parts are coming into existence successively. And it's very natural to think that's threatened by the eternalist view, where we're thinking of reality as a block, a static block. And that's a kind of spatializing of time. It's kind of leaving very little room for the idea of the passage of time. So there's a lot there that I agree with. I mean, I'll make one, because there's so many great questions from each of you, and I know time's running out. I'll be, if I can say something just very briefly about the growing block idea as well. So we might think when something grows in size, you might think it grows in size by having more and more spatial parts over time. That doesn't get us the idea that the spatial part that was here is the spatial part that is there. So the idea of growth doesn't get you the idea that the thing that was here is numerically identical with the thing that ends up here. And that's what you need for the endurantist picture and the movement through time. We want numerical identity of what's here and what's here. So that's part of why I think that the growing block idea doesn't quite capture that. Let me see. So maybe I should I should move on. Perhaps we could come back in discussion to explore some of those ideas further. So Tang's terrific comments. So let me say a little bit more about the mysterious idea first of all. You're absolutely right that a lot more needs to be said about how the notion of psychological orientation is working in this account, and psychological orientation towards the past and the future. Let me try and say a little bit more by first saying something about how I'm thinking about psychological orientation and its role in a conscious perspective by talking about the spatial case, and then we can compare the temporal case. So take your conscious spatial point of view that you occupy now. Focus on your visual point of view that you occupy now. There's this respect in which you're oriented to what you're visually perceiving, which isn't simply determined by the geometry of that visual perspective. Why is that? Well, let's give an example. The difference between looking up at the stars and looking down from a skyscraper isn't captured by visual geometry. So there's a sense of up and down, which isn't just the top of the visual field. I mean, if you hung me from the ceiling, right, then the ceiling would still seem to be up. So there's a sensitivity to the gravitational field, which is relevant for psychological orientation. I mean, to give another example, right now you're spatially oriented to me as being in front. So there's the left, there's the right, there's in front. And now if I keep my gaze fixed and I move my body, you're no longer oriented as being in front, you're to the left, even though my gaze has remained fixed. So your awareness of your bodily parts in bodily awareness and their relation, the parts to one another, is relevant to psychological orientation. So there's a notion that's just a spatial notion of psychological orientation that will give you maybe a bit of a sense of what I mean by psychological orientation. So in the temporal case, I want to suggest similarly, there's a psychological orientation that's temporal and not spatial. And let me say a little bit more about how I'm thinking about the point of view. And this is going to be relevant to some of your second points about the relevance of occurrence and how we're thinking about the triangle. So there's a respect in which I'm not thinking of the conscious temporal point of view as a triangle. So here's why. First of all, take the idea again of a visual point of view, conscious visual point of view. The origin is not a point. It has spatial extension. It's spatial extension of my visual point of view. It depends on how many eyes I have and how wide apart they are. So that's a contingent on those matters. It's not a point, it has spatial extension. Similarly, I want to say the origin of your conscious temporal point of view has temporal extension. It's not a point. Okay, how do we make sense of the experience present as not a point? Well, the experience present, so think of the experience present as between my glasses. The experience present just is what falls between psychological orientation to the future and psychological orientation to the past. So by analogy, think of, remember the visual case, there was a kind of up, down. Think of a space that's experienced as neither above or below, but in between. That needn't be a point. So similarly, what falls on either side of the experience present is what counts. It determines what the experience present is. That's not a point. What's more, you're not perceiving what falls on this side and that side. That would be to confuse perceptual consciousness and time consciousness. So I'm not perceiving my past, I'm not perceiving my future. So we do get something with temporal extension that falls within the experience present, because the experience present as the origin has temporal extension, just like the origin of your visual point of view has spatial extension. But that's not yet to get us any kind of experience of passage, any kind of movement. So what's required for the sense of passage is the occurrence falling in and out. And when the occurrence falls in and out, the point of view seems to change its temporal location. So this does mean what's more, on this account, we don't start with something like this and then build to this and this. No, it's experienced over time that's prior in explanation to what goes on within those times. So there's an assumption here in the background, which I can now make explicit, which is that you can't be conscious. You can't be conscious just for an instant, but just for an instantaneous moment. Wakeful consciousness is something that occupies an interval of time. And you can't be conscious and not experience passage. So it's the experience over time that's prior to the experience at a time. And that's why occurrence is doing some work for me. So I'm precisely trying to avoid either a snapshot view of temporal awareness or what we might call a static retentional view, where you've got something that's more triangular. So those are some of the ideas that were in the background there to that. Let me say something about Tony's finally. And again, I'm sorry that these are, I'm trying to be brief because I know that we're running out of time. There's so much more to say about these really terrific points. Okay, so yeah, so Tony, I am going for trying in the end, where we eventually get to, is trying to defend an endurantist multi-locationism, according to which objects don't have temporal parts. So I think that was 246 that you had there. That's exactly the position I'm trying to defend. So in effect, at the beginning, I'm trying to give, if you like, the best arguments I can think of for 135, and then trying to diagnose where they go wrong and give arguments that get us 246. Just to say also that, look, in doing that, when I talk about the way that things, the way that an object can occupy space by filling it, right? So it has different spatial parts at different spatial locations. So this hand occupies different spatial locations by having different parts at those different spatial locations, versus it can now occupy a different location by moving. The first idea, the idea of filling, that doesn't assume anything about a Newtonian conception of space. I take that to be totally consistent with rejection of a Newtonian view. It can be consistent with relationist view, consistent with relativity theory. In fact, lots of the people who would be happy with the idea that spatial objects have spatial parts and fill regions of space by having spatial parts would be, I think, reject Newtonian view of space. So I think that's orthogonal with the Newtonian view. But on your last point about the reality of time and colors, I do think there is something to this analogy. So let me say a little bit more about that. This is where I was alluding to Nagel right at the end. So in effect, where I end up is suggesting that in order to defend that endurantist view and that notion of passage, one's got to deal with the arguments for eternalism, and they can be quite persuasive. They're good arguments for eternalism, and for many good arguments for durantism. Often I think those arguments depend on the idea that we want an account of reality, or we should have an account of reality, that what is something that Bernard Williams once described as the absolute conception. So we abstract away from any different perspectives on reality, and we think about reality as it is, independently of any perspective on it, and which can also include and encompass every single different perspective on it. Nagel's response to this, Thomas Nagel's response to this, is to say, look, in some cases, when you try and transcend a perspective and try and get the overall picture, you end up omitting some things that exist and are real. And one example of that might be colors. So description, so if you've got different creatures perceiving the world differently with respect to color vision, you might think, look, the account of reality as it is involves abstracting from each of their own distinctive visual systems and getting a description of the physical world and also their visual apparatus, which is transcended, right? That maybe is just covered by physics, bringing in your stuff about science here as well, Tony. So transcending to that view, and the idea is this is totally perspective independent, And it covers every single perspective. The Nagel point is questioning whether attempting to transcend every point of view ends up missing something out. That would mean, in effect, that the absolute conception, what you get when you strip away all of anything that's perspectival, will be an incomplete description of reality. And that's what I was suggesting towards the end. And incidentally, I think this is not unrelated to, for those of you familiar with McTaggart on the unreality of time, McTaggart talks about an A series and a B series. He also talked about a C series. So a C series is what happens when we have an order in reality, but which doesn't include what he thinks of as change, where change involves, for him, A series change. He calls that order a C series. So there is a description of reality at the C series, but he says that level of description, he says, does not include events. So again, going back to Tang's question about the role of events or occurrence in this. So the McTaggart, you just don't get events when that, what I think of equivalent as the absolute conception. Because nothing's unfolding over time. There's no real change there. Okay, I probably said more than taken far too long. I'm sorry about that, but they were really interesting, terrific points to raise. Thank you again so much.
那大家还要继续再讨论刚才的一些问题吗？
I don't know. May I ask a further question about occurrence? So as you talk about occurrence, so you would emphasize that what we perceive from a origin of temporal perspective is always something dynamic rather than static, right? And as occurrence, not as an instant, right? But my question is, we talk about we reach the top. We reached the top. The reaching the top is actually when it happened. When it happens at an instant. So so I mean something happening at an instant need not always be something I don't know, regarded as only static, right? It's an happening, right? But I mean, we can also perceive something at an instant. I would like to hear what is your explanation about it.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. I think you're absolutely right that I'd want to think of reaching the end of the talk as an instantaneous event, or if you like that.
Oh yeah.
So but here's how I think of that. So there's an event which is the whole talk. That whole event has a start and a finish.
Yeah, right.
Think of the start and the finish as temporal boundaries of the whole event.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So can we perceive temporal boundaries? I think we can. I think we can perceive, some people would disagree, but I think we can perceive stoppings and startings.
Right.
When we do, we perceive them as the boundaries of something.
Mm-hmm.
So we can only perceive the boundary as such when we perceive something which isn't instantaneous. Just as I can only perceive a boundary of the spatial boundary of the computer screen If
As
I
a
perceive
starting
part of
point or an ending point, right?
both, yeah, both.
Yeah, right.
So if you remember, so if you remember, my experience present is an interval, right? So when I perceive something starting, so my finger's the start, it's going to fall in to the experience present. Perception can only ever be over time. That's explanatory prior. If you want to explain what I perceive over time, that will include over that interval of time. No event, the beginning, and it going in the past, but you only get the beginning as such, considered as a temporal boundary, when you've got something with temporal extension that it's a boundary of. So that's consistent with the thing that was doing work in the argument towards the end was not that it's impossible to perceive instantaneous events, but whenever we're conscious, we can't merely be aware of instantaneous events. We can only be aware of instantaneous events as temporal boundaries of events that have temporal extension.
Okay. Thank you. And what we perceive must be always something as occurrence. I mean, for example, being Liu Chang, being me, is I don't know, perhaps it is now something happened to me. It's not an occurrence, it's not happening, but I don't know, it's also a fact, right?
Yeah, good. So I think, so I don't want to say you only perceive occurrences. Because why? Because I don't think objects are occurrences.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so I do want to say whenever you perceive, you do perceive occurrence, but without saying whatever you perceive is an occurrence. I don't think objects are occurrences. So what would I say about perceiving an object? Right? So I would say, this is the view. Whenever you see an object, you perceive it for some interval of time, no matter how brief. You can't merely perceive an instantaneous part of an object. So suppose you agree with me that you can never perceive just an instantaneous part of a pen. You perceive it existing for some interval of time. Now the claim is, so the pen isn't an occurrence, but the pen occupying an interval of time is an occurrence. Why? Because occupation of an interval of time is temporal movement, and temporal movement is an occurrence. So that was the thought. So it's, yeah, I definitely don't want to claim that you can only perceive occurrences, because I want to defend this endurantist idea that there's a distinction between objects and occurrences, and the pen isn't an occurrence. But it does involve a view about what the occupation over an interval of time of a pen is. I want to say, because I want the endurantist view, the pen that's here now is numerically identical with the pen that's here now.
Yeah.
And so numerically the same thing occupies those different temporal locations. And it does so by moving through time. That's why it doesn't have temporal parts. Because it doesn't occupy that interval of time by having different temporal parts at different temporal locations. The life of the pen has different temporal parts at different temporal locations, but the pen doesn't. This is numerically identical with this, and it gets to be, we get that picture just by saying it's moved its temporal location. And its movement of temporal location is the occurrence. So even if you see an entirely static scene, what we'd say is no change, that no change in that static scene is something that, when we perceive it, seems to last at least some interval of time. It takes time to be still. And it takes time to perceive something being still. What kind of thing takes time? Not objects, but their occupation of an interval of time, which is a temporal movement. That's why you can't see the pen without seeing, in some sense. I mean, I don't want to say seeing, actually, because I don't think you perceive, but without being conscious of, through time consciousness, the object continuing to exist throughout that interval of time, where that's numerically the same object. Does that help a little bit make sense of what I have in mind?
Yeah. It's very helpful. But I wonder whether Zhiheng also has some questions, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I'm not sure if the idea is that endurism is simply your assumption, or what you're talking about today about perception has anything to do with supporting that metaphysical position. I mean, I'm not an pejorist, but suppose I am. I'm not gonna be swayed by anything you said today. No,
Good.
I don't think so. I can't,
Yeah. So here's one way of just seeing what I'm trying to do, at least, right? Which is, okay, so you've got good arguments for durantism. In a way, I haven't provided any knockdown arguments against durantism. What I've tried to do is point to what I see as important connections between different issues, which often aren't brought together. Okay, so one is the metaphysics of persistence debate, right? What's the right metaphysics for the persistence of objects like pens? Should we be pejorantist, endurantist, and so on? Here's a second theme. How do we explain the experience of change, temporal experience in general? Here's a third theme. Should we accept that the absolute conception is a complete description of reality? Okay. So I'm making connections between those three issues. And I'm suggesting that the defense of the endurantist position against the pejorantist argument depends on getting right temporal conscious perspective and then linking it to that third issue, which is enduring objects and irreducible occurrence can be accepted as part of reality if we deny that the absolute conception is giving you a complete description of reality. So it's trying to draw connections between those three things. That's why the experience stuff does some work, right? Because the idea that transcending a conscious perspective gives you a complete description of reality, I think is doing some work in the background, in the metaphysical debate. And so I need the right account of a conscious temporal point of view and what it's a conscious temporal point of view upon, namely objects and occurrence, in order to offer this defense of the endurantist position and irreducible occurrence by rejecting that last move, which is the absolute conception gives you the complete description of reality. And you're absolutely right. I didn't give anything like sufficient arguments for each of these positions. It was more trying to, the interest of seeing the connections between them and how you could defend the endurantist position against the pejorantist if you took a certain stance on conscious temporal awareness and you took a stance on that more general issue about the absolute conception.
But it looks like pejorantist can take the second point as saying like they can take, whatever you think you are perceiving as some kind of illusion, right? They can be an illusionist.
Yeah, you could.
But third point, they can be, I think it's no problem for them to be a eliminist. I mean, a lot of metaphysical positions, they take as an advantage of the point of view to be able to reduce the certain things we think exist.
Absolutely.
So physics to reduce, they don't think that's man, basically. And so what's wrong with predominant statistics is that, well, according to my metaphysical position, there's no such thing as occurrence, and that's a rightful elimination.
Good. Yeah. Agreed. So you could be, so there's a different position. You could be eliminativist about these things. Just as, so if you remember the Nagel discussion, I mean, I guess the most famous aspect of the Nagel discussion is about what it's like to have an experience. And just as with that debate, you could be an eliminativist about what it's like. There is no conscious character. That would be the eliminativist position. Or you could be a reductionist about phenomenal character, conscious character. You think there is, but it's just reducible to something else, the physics. And obviously Nagel's trying to avoid both of those, and avoiding both of those in part by inviting an argument for the claim that that we need to be reductive in that way. Because we're assuming that the absolute conception is a complete description of reality. But one other thing to mention is that it's very, very difficult to explain certain kinds of illusions. For example, the illusion of endurantism and passage of time. It's very difficult to find a good account of the illusion out there that explains it, which is why in many ways it might be better just to say we eliminate it rather than reduce it and explain it. But let me give you another example. If you think that this is going to go back to Tony's point, we can use color as an example. So suppose I think that, what is have a view on which I have a conscious point of view on an object with color. And I decide that color is something that is in reality something that the physics specifies, and physics doesn't mention colors. And now we might think, okay, so why did we reduce that color to the physics? And here I'm not talking about supervenience, because we can just accept supervenience, a global supervenience. And I say, why reduce that quality to a certain range of physical properties? And you might think, because I want an account of how this subject gets to perceive that bit of reality in a way that's consistent with that subject perceiving that bit of reality, even though their experiences differ in phenomenology. So I think about what's going on with this individual physically, what's going on with this individual physically, and what's going on with this bit of reality physically. Because I'm worried otherwise there's an inconsistency. Notice though, to think that the way this subject perceives the object is inconsistent with the way this subject perceives the object assumes that they're perceiving the same bit of reality. They're perceiving the same properties. Why should we assume they're perceiving the same properties? Well, one answer might be because ultimately, causally, those are the properties that are responsible for the experience. Our best theory of how bits of the world get to cause has to do is something the physics described. However, that in turn is resting on a further assumption that the causal relation is sufficient to determine what the object of perception is. And then there are many things causing my current visual perception, many things, many of which I'm not perceiving. And I'm certainly not perceiving the unobservable things because they're unobservable. So why think that what I am perceiving has to be characterized in terms of the unobservable, as opposed to saying this property is a bit of reality. It's not a bit of my psychological life. It's a bit of reality which doesn't get captured in physics. It's not inconsistent with physics because physics doesn't talk about this property. That's a bit of reality that isn't captured by the physics. whatever this thing is, maybe, all of these properties supervene on whatever the physics describes. But that's not yet to say that all there is what's in that supervenient space. And it's not to say that whatever there is have to be reducible to that supervenient space. So there's similar kinds of moves going on with occurrence, and yes, you can be a limitist, yes, you can be a reductionist, but there are a lot of assumptions one needs which can be questioned to get that far.
Right.
就是我们时间其实也已经超出比较长的时间，那就如果大家没有其他的问题的话，我们或许就在这里结束。然后非常感谢各位嘉宾的精彩分享和讨论。那由于时间的关系，我们今天就到这里，也非常感谢观看直播的观众朋友们。Thanks very much for coming and giving us this talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much again for inviting me and for your brilliant comments and questions. And it's been a real pleasure. Really good to see you. Thank you.
感谢各位老师的分享，也感谢大家的用心聆听。哲学与认知科学明德讲坛暨服务器艺术认知心灵哲学系列论坛本期到此结束，也非常感谢各院校机构和媒体的大力支持与参与。我们期待下次再见，谢谢。